1, 2, 3, 4.
We're grappling with the Ten Commandments. You know, one of the really interesting things that I remember as I learned the Ten Commandments, especially from Luther and the Large Catechism, is that Luther connects the Ten Commandments to each other. It's not 10, independent bullet points that have nothing to do with one another, but rather that they grow to one another and relate to one another. It's why when Luther is talking about soldiers and asking if it's a sin for a soldier to kill a man, he says, no, the reason it's not is because the fifth commandment comes after the fourth commandment. And the fourth commandment establishes the state and the sword, and that means that the fourth commandment, the state has the authority to end life if it's needed in service to other life. Now, looking at this, the connection between the commandments is particularly interesting. For example, there's a connection between the fifth commandment and the sixth commandment. You shall not murder and you shall not commit adultery. We think, for example, of David, who commits adultery with Bathsheba, and then to cover it up, he goes and murders Uriah, her husband, in order that he might get away with his crimes. So that the commandments are bound up together and are connected to each other. Now, I have a picture that I like to draw that I call the Ten Commandment Fractal. I get to make these things up. I'm the one drawing the picture, right? And the Ten Commandment Fractal is my way of kind of imagining how the commandments are connected to each other. Now, use it if it's helpful or not. The basic idea is this. If you've ever seen if you can imagine there's a spring, and that spring has a waterfall, and that waterfall goes into a pool, and then that goes into another waterfall like this, that the commandments are somehow structured like this. You have the first commandment, second and third, you have the fourth commandment, and then you have all the rest, 5 through 10, okay? So here's the picture. In the first commandment, God gives us himself, and he says, I alone am your God. And out of that comes the great gift of God's name and God's word, the second commandment and the third commandment. Now, the fourth commandment is its own new kind of spring. Of course, it springs out of the first commandment, so that these commandments are all related to one another. But it's from the fourth commandment that the fifth commandment, you shall not murder, the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery, the seventh commandment, you shall not steal, and the eighth commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So that all of these commandments are now bound up to one another and are in service to one another. Now, the ninth and 10th commandments, in fact, wrap all the way around, because covetousness is idolatry, St. Paul teaches us, and this is particularly important. I think, in fact, we'll talk about it in our next study, that the breaking of the commandments begins with false desires. So to break any of the commandments, you're first going to be breaking the 9th and 10th commandment, and you're eventually going to be breaking the first commandment. Now, here's the interesting thing. You can't break the 6th commandment here without also breaking the 4th and the 1st. You can't break the 7th without breaking the 4th and the 1st. So the commandments are bound up together both in their instituting, in their connection, and in their breaking. Now, to think about this a little bit more, in the 4th commandment, the Lord is instituting both the family and the state. And the family is where life and marriage and property and a good reputation are found. It's where they're created. And the state comes along, and it is to protect those things, so that the commandments are bound together all in this way. So this is my picture of the 10 Commandments and the 10 Commandment fractal. There's a couple of ways that we consider why this is helpful. So, for example, we realize that the 4th, 5th, and 6th commandment are bound together so that life is found in the middle of family and marriage. There's a move to disconnect, for example, life and marriage, or maybe new life and marriage, through the sexual revolution and the disconnect between intimacy and childbirth. And so they try to drive a wedge between those two things. And that also serves to try to drive a wedge between these two things. But when we consider the 10 Commandment fractal, we realize, hey, these things go together. When we think about then, for example, property and the 7th commandment and the gift of stuff, we realize that stuff is there in service to marriage, in service to life, in service to family. And that's why God has given us this. When we think of the 8th commandment, where the Lord gives us a name and a good reputation, we realize that our name is really bound to our stuff, because what it is to have stuff is to put our name on it, that we have a name that comes from our family. That's the 4th commandment name. And wives have a 6th commandment name if they've been married and their husband has given them their name. And that even in this way, the Lord has given us a 3rd commandment name, what we call our baptismal name. So that all of these institutions and all of these things of God are bound up to one another. Now, I think it also so happens, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the thermometer of the conscience, that there's a way that when the devil is hardening our heart, he's hardening us, say, according to the 5th commandment, to disregard life, and the result is kind of a gangrene, that disregard for life is going to spread itself to a disregard to the family, a disregard to marriage, and even a disregard to God and His name and to His word. So that all of these together, we can see that the devil is working to destroy it. So there you go. There's the 10 Commandment fractal. And it's a beginning. I hope this is a beginning as you meditate on the 10 Commandments and think about the connection between all of them. All right. This is done. Oh, so you can go back to liking us.